We're looking forward to a very special program which is going to be focused on the incredible innovation in our region to combat Alzheimer's disease. Senator Ed Markey will give the keynote remarks, followed by a panel discussion with council members who are leading the way in Alzheimer's research. Also next week, we have a great virtual program planned. We will learn more about the impact of the landmark Inflation Reduction Act on the energy landscape here in New England. On November 2nd, Congressman Jim McGovern, the chair of the House Rules Committee, will be our guest for a Capitol Hill report across town at the Seaport Hotel. And last, but most certainly not least, I hope all of you will join us in Boston on November 7th, the night before the election, for our annual celebration, where we're back after 2 years of virtual events. And we have an incredible lineup of honorees, and it promises to be a very special night, to say the least. To those of you in the room who have already sponsored the event, we say thank you, thank you, thank you. And to those who have not, there's still time. I believe Larry is here, and he'll be more than happy to try. But as of this morning, we have 210 tables sold, and at 10 person tables of over 2,000 people already indicating their support of the New England Council, which is extraordinary. We're not the biggest organization in New England, but we obviously fight above our weight to have over 2,000 people at our dinner, which is going to say an awful lot about the New England Council. Today we're delighted to welcome back a great friend of the New England Council, a tremendous advocate for our region, Congressman Seth Moulton. As many of you know, the Congressman is a veteran himself, now a member of one of the most powerful committees, the House Armed Services Committee. So we thought it would be fitting to invite one of region's most well-known defense companies to introduce our very special guest this morning, Raytheon. Raytheon has been a member of the New England Council for many, many, many years. Fortunate to have Tim Del Duce serve on our board of directors, and we're also pleased to be able to join today by Paul Favaro, who is the president of Raytheon's Air Power Business Area, who I have the pleasure to introduce now, who will now introduce our very special guest this morning. Paul.
Good morning. So I promised I would keep my introduction to no more than 45 minutes. Appreciate y'all coming here this morning. So again, my name is Paul Ferraro. I've been working at Raytheon for about 25 years, and really very proud of the work we do. So, Congressman, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for all your support you've given us. As was mentioned, I do have the honor of introducing the Congressman this morning. So I do have a few words on his background, which is incredibly impressive. Congressman Seth Moulton joined the Marines in 2001. That was days after he graduated from college and just a few months before the attacks on 9/11. Leading a frontline infantry platoon in the 1st Marine Company to enter Baghdad, he later worked to establish a free and independent Iraqi media. Served as a liaison to senior Iraqi military and political leaders under General Petraeus. After returning home from Iraq, Seth used the GI Bill to earn joint degrees in both business and public policy, but it wasn't long before he was called to serve again, this time in his home district here in Massachusetts. He was named the most effective freshman Democrat his first term, and Seth has consistently delivered results in a divided Washington. He is the only member of Congress to earn 2 Democracy Awards from the Congressional Management Foundation, one in 2018 for transparency, and a second in 2020 for having the best constituent service in all of Congress. Today, Seth sits on 3 committees, member of the Budget Committee, the House Armed Services Committee, and the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Seth works tirelessly to support the local businesses and veterans, advance civil rights, and grow the economy. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Seth Moulton.
Paul, thank you very much. Jim, always a pleasure. And for all of you here joining us virtually, it's great to be back. It's really special to be back in person. Not to quibble with the details, but we actually just a few weeks ago won a 3rd Democracy Award. So we're very proud of that. The team is doing extraordinary work. Usually you get points in Congress for saying obnoxious things on Twitter or going on cable news, but actually doing the work of being a member of Congress is it's nice to get recognized for that too. So I appreciate you being here. It's wonderful to be back in person. You know, we're back in person in Washington with all of our events now too. And one of our best traditions in Washington are these Library of Congress dinners. It's the only bipartisan, bicameral event that we have in Washington on a regular basis. So every member of the House and Senate gets to come and listen to a great author interviewed by David Rubenstein, and we get to bring one guest. And it's a wonderful invitation. Recently, at one of those dinners, the Librarian of Congress came up to me and said, you know, Congressman Moulton, I've got to tell you, I really like your background. And I was flattered because, you know, there are 535 of us between the House and the Senate. And so, you know, for her to recognize my background, I thought was pretty special. But I was also curious. I said, you know, ma'am, wondering, you know, what is it that you like? Maybe she has a relative in the Marines, or perhaps she appreciates my rather rare physics degree, which is unusual for Congress. Plenty of Congress. There are far more people in Congress who don't believe in science than have physics degrees. So I said, "What is it?" She said, "No, I really like your background." I said, "No, I appreciate that. It's truly flattering. But I'm just curious, what part of it is, you know, about my background do you like?" She said, "No, your background, your background on TV, your Zoom background, great." Some people say politics is superficial these days, but you know, young people come up and ask me, what kind of background do you need to get into this job? I say, plants. People really like plants. Anyway, look, I'm eager to get to your questions. I've got some really bright minds in the room, so please get those questions ready, and we'll have a good discussion and a good debate. But first, I want to just share a few thoughts. And I decided to talk about a topic that I think is top of mind for most of you, the business leaders of our community. And that is how we keep Massachusetts competitive, innovative, and leading both nationally and globally. John F. Kennedy once said that change is the law of life, and those who look only to the past or present are certain to miss the future. Our world has changed a lot since I last joined you in person. We've experienced a pandemic, an insurrection, and we are still in the midst of the largest land war in Europe since World War II. Our realities have changed in many ways, and there's no question that the way you all do business is different as well. Remote work makes attracting and retaining talent harder. Supply chain challenges mean that simply maintaining inventory is a lot more complicated. And inflation makes everything more difficult at work and at home. During the worst of the pandemic, Massachusetts wasn't perfect, but we often set the example. We followed the science, even as our understanding of COVID changed. Our healthcare system was prepared and resourced. We built an impressive COVID testing infrastructure by working with partners like MIT and Harvard. The Commonwealth's own Moderna developed one of the world's best COVID vaccines in record time. We've had our missteps, but when it comes to how we move forward from the pandemic, how we live with and manage COVID, I am very optimistic. But in our post-pandemic world, we're falling behind in many other important measures. Massachusetts' ability to attract the best in business, in tech, in talent, has historically been because the Commonwealth is a great place to live and a welcoming environment for business and innovation. Yet last year we lost more people to other states than anywhere but Illinois, California, and New York. We also have the best universities in the entire world, yet at the Joseph G. Pine Magnet School in Lowell, ceilings are literally falling down in classrooms due to rust and water damage. And there are stories like this from schools across the Commonwealth. Our schools need to be much better equipped for the future. But we also need to look back and have an honest, fact-based debate about whether or not we kept students out of school for too long during the pandemic. That's a debate many people around here want to avoid, but it's part of following and learning the science as well. because this probably won't be the last pandemic we face, and we're going to be facing the consequences of this pandemic for years to come. To reuse an overused cliche, which happens to be true, those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it and miss the future in the process. So a few thoughts on where we go from here. First, you know this is coming, the number one issue holding back growth in Massachusetts for years, in study after survey after study, is transportation and the housing access that good transportation generates. Yet I don't know if our infrastructure has ever been worse. Our traffic is the worst in the nation. They closed the Orange Line for a month, the first time in history they've closed a line for a month. And the trains are now slower than before. And as our trains careen off the tracks, so have our aspirations. We sure as hell are not going to entice top-tier companies to Massachusetts with a 125-year-old transit system that is finally restored to operating the way it did 125 years ago. So what is transformative? It's not adding lanes to highways, which has been proven to increase congestion, especially in cities. And don't get me wrong, I love electric cars, but let's just dispel the myth that they're going to solve all our problems. Subsidizing cars means more people drive. We'll just be in silent traffic jams. No, transformative infrastructure means fixing the housing crisis by connecting Springfield to Boston with trains the rest of the world has that get you there in 40 minutes, on time, 10 times a day. Morocco is doing it. We can do it in Massachusetts. Many of you probably have houses on the Cape. How many people have houses on the Cape here? I'm sure there's a good number. Well, if we just expand the bridges over the canal, there will be more cars on Cape Cod jamming up our small towns. High-speed rail to Hyannis would get you there in 25 minutes on summer Friday afternoons and back in 25 minutes on Sunday evenings. That would be transformative. Now, maybe there's some crazy reason I haven't thought of why you think some of these are bad ideas, but the point is we're not even having that debate. These ideas are barely on the table, and the world is passing us by. Let me address another elephant in the room, taxes. If we pass the fair share tax this election day, our transportation system could finally get the transformative level of investment it needs. But first, we have to show people that their taxes will in fact be invested in transformative projects with real return on investment, because they make a difference in our lives, not just more of the same that we should be doing in our sleep with the revenue we already have. Second, we need to ensure that the industries that have traditionally kept us on top stay that way. An example, we all know biotech and what competitiveness in biotech means, but Massachusetts also has one of the most talented defense and technology sectors in the entire world. Yet I think we've taken that superiority for granted for too long. A few years ago, I led the Bipartisan Future Defense Task Force, which warned that the U.S. wasn't modernizing quickly enough. Notably, we called out the critical role the private sector plays in research and development in partnership with university-funded research. I just spent the week in the Western Pacific visiting Taiwan, the Philippines, and Guam on the eve of Chairman Xi's big party speech. Right now, America has two very bad options if China were to invade Taiwan. We either ignore it, and the credibility of our deterrent is torn to shreds the world over, achieving not peace through strength, but war through weakness, inevitably costing American lives for decades to come. Or, the second option is we take China on as we've implied we will, and a lot of young Americans die right away. Two terrible options, which is why it is so critical, 1,000 times more so than in Ukraine, that we deter and prevent this war from ever starting. Showing China we will beat them in defense technology is critical to achieving this. And while some progress has been made, we are still not even close to where we need to be. Leaders in defense in Massachusetts have a critical role to play, but we need much more innovation and productivity out of our defense industrial base. If our biggest defense contractors don't feel the urgency to move fast and break things, to experiment and innovate, it comes at a cost to our state, to our troops, and to our country. Third, we must be healthy enough to rise up to these challenges. Massachusetts leads the world in healthcare innovation. We led on COVID response. Now, let's lead the world on mental health. It's the healthcare challenge of today, and we're already well positioned to do this. I co-authored the bill to establish 988 as the national mental health hotline with a fellow veteran from across the aisle. And I'm thrilled to say that the number went live nationally almost exactly 3 months ago. Massachusetts was one of the best positioned states to launch 988 when call volume increased over 40% this summer since establishing the 3-digit number. We were ready to answer the phones and get people help, already saving countless lives. But this is like the lowest hanging fruit. The ROI on mental health care is so high because it's been ignored for so long. There's a lot more to do. There's so much more I could say, but I'll end with this. To do all this right, to confront the future head on, to tackle the greatest challenges in building transformative transportation and access to housing, to letting our defense sector lead, to prevent wars like the war with China, and to truly lead the nation on mental health care. To do all of this, we have to have a strong democracy under our feet. We need to be able to have tough debates about our future in an honest forum, not one where shouting matches on cable TV or vicious fights on Twitter score the most points. I want you all to know that you may not always agree with everything I say. In fact, I'm sure there's nobody in the room today who agrees 100% with everything I've said this morning. But I'm someone who believes in having that honest debate. It's why yesterday morning I was on MSNBC, and 20 minutes later I was on Fox News, alongside a Republican colleague, not afraid to debate, but also not afraid to find common ground. It's why I'm proud to rank consistently as the most bipartisan member of the Massachusetts delegation, and why I will always work across the aisle to get things done, whether it's spending a week in the Indo-Pacific with a Republican from Florida, or partnering with a Republican Air Force veteran from Utah to pass 988. The craziness has got to stop. There's too much important work to do. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
We have a couple of minutes for questions. Marjorie Aarons Barron, do you have a question?
Yes.
Hi, Marjorie.
I wonder, thinking back a few years and looking ahead, regardless of the outcome of the midterms and whoever ends up controlling the House, to what extent do you see it as important to change the Democratic leadership of the House, and what role would you expect to play?
So obviously this is a cause that I've championed since literally the day I was running for Congress, not even since I've been elected. I think that if we're going to be the party of the future, the party of innovation, the party of young people, the party that represents a very diverse set of views, then we can't just have all of our leadership be in their 80s. And we've got to get new ideas, and we've got to show young people that they're going to have a chance to be represented. And a few years ago, we had a leadership challenge that I was involved in, and that received a lot of grassroots support, but ultimately was not enough to change leadership. But we did get a deal. We got a deal that Speaker Pelosi would step down after this term, and I expect her to honor that deal.
And And what role would you expect to play?
So actually, I don't have, here's the thing. I believe in new leadership in the House. I personally don't have any interest in being a leader in the House. These are very transactional jobs where you're always just counting votes. And I'm more interested in passing legislation and getting things done. Doing things like passing 988. Making sure that we're ready for this war in the Pacific. It's very hard to do those things if you're always worried about counting votes and getting elected to a leadership post. So it's just not a place where and I said that, by the way, I got a lot of questions. Well, why don't you run for Speaker? No, I'm not running for Speaker. No interest in it. I'm interested in doing the job and continuing to do the work. And, and winning awards like having the best constituent services in the entire country.
Jim Siegel, do you want to follow up because you have talked about, quote, rules reform, maybe?
Thank you, Jim. Just building on that, Congressman, Republicans have one thing right, I think, and that is 60-year term limits for chairs or ranking members. And I was wondering, do you think the Democratic caucus would adopt something like that, whether it be 6 years or 8 years or even 10 years? But Richie Neal went in 1988, and I think he became chairman in 2018. There's something I think wrong about that.
Yeah, I once introduced Richie at a breakfast and said, he was elected in 1988, which was a big year for me too because I hit double digits. And I'm not sure he appreciated that, but Richie's a great friend, and he certainly
appreciated that.
Yeah. Now you know why he's not running for Speaker.
Richie is one of the committee chairmen who's remarkably qualified to do his job. But a lot of people are appointed because they're loyalists or they're quiet and they're not going to rock the boat, rather than because they're, leading thinkers in their field. In fact, there was one point a couple years ago where the last 3 committee chairmen that we lost in the House were one because he resigned due to sexual harassment, one because she died, and a third because she was in prison. That's not a record of leadership that we should be proud of as Democratic lawmakers. So I agree with you. I actually spoke with someone who's probably running for Speaker literally yesterday afternoon about this, and he intends to make it part of his platform. But I don't know if we'll be able to muster the votes to change it, but I certainly hope we will.
Did you follow up?
Please, Jim, yeah.
Speaker O'Neill said that the way to advance in the House usually is either through death, disgrace, or defeat of the person in front of you. So that's what happens.
Yeah, that's sadly true.
Paul?
It's not a merit-based institution, and it should be.
Mr. MIT?
Thank you very much, Jim. Congressman, it's a real honor to have you here, and I greatly value your strong desire to work in a bipartisan fashion. I think that's just so lost.
Thank you for obliging my request to ask a question, because I knew I'd get a good question from you, Paul. So thank you.
Well, let me ask it first before you declare that.
That's probably safer. That's true.
You've
Good point.
been here before to speak very eloquently about the north-south rail link, and this morning you touched on transportation.
Mm-hmm.
Could you go a little deeper to help us think about ways that we can deal and confront the situation that we're currently in here to get better train service for places like Kendall Square and other centers of development, to think about how to deal with the structural problems that we have? Is the legislature totally missing from this debate? I wonder if you'd guide us a little bit more into thinking, because when you talked about the rail link, I was just so impressed with the value that would bring to our community. Today you mentioned the trains to Springfield. All of that deserves much greater attention. I wonder if you'd talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, Paul, thank you very much. And the truth of the matter is I didn't mention the rail link and a whole bunch of other things this morning just because I'm trying to contain myself. I could easily speak for hours just about transportation. And that's because I think it is so transformative. Really, the number one issue in Massachusetts that everybody talks about is housing, right? But look, we're not going to put up apartments in Boston Common, okay? So the way to increase access to housing is to improve transportation, to make it easier to get to the housing stock that exists or places that are more affordable. Drive around Springfield and look at the opportunities there. But you cannot live in Springfield and work in Boston today. Nor, by the way, could you live in Boston and work in Springfield. But in the entire rest of the world, like, it's very hard to find a developed country that doesn't have high-speed rail. So I'm not talking about some futuristic, Hyperloop, which is going to fail, by the way, or other maglev or whatnot. We're just talking about the stuff that, like, literally Morocco, with 3% of our GDP, is building because it's a better return on investment than the old-fashioned kind of trains that we have. And if you had the North-South Rail Link, a project that was originally postponed due to, does anyone remember this bit of trivia? I've used this here before. Originally postponed due to World War I. Then you could get all over this region by quickly going through the city. So coming from Salem into Boston would take about 20 minutes. 20 minutes to the heart of Boston. It took me an hour and 20 minutes to drive this morning. But not only that, I could get back out to Westwood, where my sister lives, 20 minutes after that. So a 40-minute hop. You know how long it would take to drive from Salem to Westwood at rush hour today? You might hit 2 hours. So transportation should not be about just having an alternative to driving because there's too much traffic. It should be about getting to places faster than we could 50 or 100 years ago, or 5 years ago. And that's what the rest of the world is doing. They're investing in ways to move us more quickly. They're not just preventing their trains from catching on fire. So I think that our aspirations are pathetically low. Pathetically low. And you just look around the rest of the world to see this. The MBTA recently proposed building a new station in Lynn. The plans that they put forward look like a station from the 19th century. Why, when I go to Logan Airport, do I not have to wait outside in the rain for a plane? We don't do that, right? But if you take the train from Lynn, you're expected to wait outside in the rain. That's the expectation that we have. That's the standard that we've set. The message that we're saying is, if you want to use a super carbon intensive mode of transportation like planes, then we're going to put a roof over your head. But if you want to do something responsible and take some cars off the road and take the train from Lynn every day, then you're going to wait out in the cold and the rain. That's the message that we're sending to Massachusetts people. That's not the message that they're getting everywhere else in the world. You go to Europe, you don't wait out in the rain for trains. So we have to have much bigger aspirations. And part of getting there is recognizing that we've got to be smarter about how we spend our money. Because if you look at the amount of money that the MBTA spent on just getting the orange line back to a point where, again, it's literally going slower than it was before the shutdown, but at least the trains haven't caught on fire again. It's unbelievable. It's pathetic. And the legislature is largely at fault for that. That is true. So a lot more I could say there, but the point is this. If you have transformative transportation, you change the way people live and work in Massachusetts. You change access to housing. You make it a much more appealing city for people who don't have cars or don't want to have cars or simply want to be able to go out to dinner and not have to worry about driving home drunk. Some of the best restaurants in America right now are in Portland, Maine. How many people go to Portland, Maine for dinner? But in Europe, Portland would be a 45-minute train ride away. You could easily hop up there for dinner and hop back. But we don't even imagine that. We don't even think about that possibility because our sights are set so low. We don't need to be the Jetsons to get to Maine in 45 minutes. We just have to be riding on trains that the entire rest of the world has while we're falling behind. But that's what I'm asking for.
Well, I'm interested, given both your military and political backgrounds, what you see as a realistic endgame in Ukraine?
What do I see as a realistic endgame in Ukraine? Look, I think this is one of the hardest and most important questions that we have to answer, because the fundamental problem in Ukraine today is that every imaginable, at least as far as I've seen, every imaginable settlement on the Russian side is completely unacceptable to the Ukrainians. And so you see people saying, well, look, this is a terrible war, we've got it to stop. Why doesn't Ukraine just give a little bit of its eastern territory to Russia and some sort of compromise? I don't think Zelensky is ever going to agree to that, because I don't think the Ukrainian people want it. I don't think that he wants it. And most importantly, even if he were to agree to that, he wouldn't be president the next day. On the flip side, how is Putin going to back off from this? So I think that the only way this ends is really to effectively defeat Russia in Ukraine, to push them out. And that's the only way that we're going to prevent this from happening again. If there's one lesson we should have learned from the last 10 years, is that you cannot expect Putin to just stop at the next place. Well, he took Georgia, but he's not going to go anywhere else. Oh, he took Crimea, but he's not going to go anywhere else. That's not going to happen. So it's a terribly difficult situation, but that's why it's so important to support Ukraine to actually win this war.
Lisa?
Congressman, I want to go back to something you said earlier in your remarks about the impacts that the past couple of years have had on young people.
Yes.
And the fact that we haven't really come to terms with the educational loss, the mental health issues, that frankly as an employer are going to be walking through our front door as these kids age, and we're not.
For a generation.
For a generation. So how do we think about that, and how do we get our hands around that as we move forward over the next couple of years? Because I think we've got to figure out something.
Well, Lisa, thank you for asking this. I mean, the first point I would make is that, you know, if you read the Boston Globe articles on this, on the new test scores that are coming back and the education results, there's all sorts of lamenting about how bad it is and questioning about what to do. But no one wants to broach the elephant in the room issue, which was maybe we should have kept kids in school longer. Why? Because that's a political football, and that sounds like you're giving props to a Republican. We have to have that debate honestly, because this is going to happen again. And we have to make an honest accounting of where we went right and where we went wrong. You know, were we really trying to protect kids, or were we just trying to protect teachers by keeping them out of school? I think that's a question that we need to ask. In terms of going forward, I think that look, we're going to see a blip in prison populations in 30 years because of the effects of keeping kids out of school during this pandemic, and we never make that accounting when we weigh the risks, right? And you're right, employers are going to have to deal with this for a long time. So to deal with what's already happened, the damage that's been done, I think requires a really concerted, targeted effort addressed at this generation where there will be this gap that surges mental health resources, that surges extra tutoring, that maybe asks some tough questions about whether we just need to hold a bunch of kids back and have them repeat a grade. But those are the questions that we have to address aggressively right now, or you're right. 30 years from now, we're still going to be complaining about this. We're still going to see these dips, these gaps in this generation that was so hurt by the pandemic. And look, listen, I don't by any means with my remarks mean to criticize the well-meaning people, including the scientists and clinicians and everyone else who said we got to be careful and keep kids out of school. That was all well-intentioned. But we have to honestly ask the question, what are the costs and benefits of doing that? And I don't think we're having that honest conversation.
Peter Howe?
I wanted to ask Congressman, thank you so much for making time to be with us. Electoral Count Act reform, your assessment of that, and in particular, who needs to hear from us to get that over the finish line?
So Electoral Count Act reform, for those of you who don't know, is meant to address kind of the crazy old-fashioned laws that made it possible for there to be these questions around counting the votes with Vice President Pence and everything else after the election when President Trump tried to overthrow the results. There's bipartisan consensus that we need to do this. There's a strong group in the Senate of Republican senators who are working with Democrats to pass this law. There is disappointingly, a much smaller group in the House. Kevin McCarthy continues to try to just politicize January 6th rather than learn from it, which is one of the things that makes him such a dangerous person to be the next Speaker of the House if Republicans win the midterms. But I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll be able to get it over the finish line through the efforts of the Senate. But all these things are in doubt, and there's a lot hanging on the results of the election, and that's why people like me are working really hard to do what we can to support Democrats across the country and make sure that Kevin McCarthy is not the next Speaker of the House. I think there are a lot of Republicans who would be reasonable people here and have the political courage to do the right thing, but I don't think Kevin McCarthy is going to have that courage to stand up to his own party, his own caucus, to the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world, and put a stop to this craziness.
Can you talk a little bit about some of your colleagues and their races that they're facing here in New England, beginning with the 2nd Congressional in Rhode Island, that looks like it's very, very, very competitive and leaning right now almost Republican. If the election were held today, your colleague in the 1st Congressional District in New Hampshire, Chris Pappas, has a competitive race. Your colleague in the 2nd Congressional District in Maine, Jared Golden, has a very competitive, and then Joanna Hayes, the 4th District in Connecticut, competitive. So can you talk about how they're doing?
Jim, that's a great summary. No, thank you very much. As many of you know, I started an organization a few years ago called Serve America, which intends to support service veterans, not just military veterans, but national service veterans, so Marine Corps, Peace Corps, AmeriCorps, who want to serve in office. And the theory is quite simple, that if you have some experience serving the country before, maybe you'll bring that service ethos to Washington, which I think we all know is desperately needed. Seth Magaziner, as a Teach for America alumnus, is one of our candidates, and he's running in this seat that Jim Langevin gave up after an incredibly distinguished career in the House. Really a remarkable, inspiring career for all of you who know Jim. And Seth's a great candidate. He is the treasurer of Rhode Island, so he knows how to win races, but he has a tough race. He has a tough race against a Republican who's relatively moderate, relatively well-known, did pretty well in some statewide contests running for governor, and so we can't take this for granted. And I think a lot of people are. Chris Pappas up in New Hampshire, of course, sits in this historically flip-flop seat that's gone back and forth from Republicans to Democrats for many years. And then over in Maine, Jared Golden has one of the toughest seats in the entire country. I mean, his district votes unquestionably for Donald Trump. He's a true hero, Marine, of course, to hold down this seat, and it's pretty incredible. I mean, you look at, for example, the last Senate race, right? A lot of people went up and supported the Democratic candidate for Senate, who was running statewide. So there are 2 congressional districts in Maine, one represented by Shelley Pingree that's overwhelmingly Democratic, Portland and Environs, and then one represented by Jared Golden that's overwhelmingly Republican. You know, on that statewide ballot, our Senate candidate lost, and yet Jared Golden still won a seat. Like, that's how good he is. That's how important it is that we have him up there holding down the fort. But is it going to be tough? Yes. And he's running against someone who has held that seat before. He's running against the person that he beat to become a member of Congress a few years ago. So these are tough seats. Johanna Hayes as well, out in Connecticut. She's another Serve America endorsee. Teacher of the Year, I think, in the entire country. Another really inspiring woman, but she's got a tough race too. So I think it's tough across the board. I think we're going to wake up on November 9th, the day after the election, and say, wow, the pollsters were way off. I could see it going in either direction. I could see Democrats remarkably hanging on to the House. I could see Republicans winning it in a landslide. But I wouldn't be surprised if we're surprised by the results. So that's why it's important to work hard. Mm-hmm. By the way, my team would be maybe a little bit angry at me if I missed the opportunity to mention that my seat used to be a frontline district. My predecessor won this seat by 1 point. It used to take millions of dollars of national party money to hold on to this seat. And we're very proud of the fact that we've turned that around. The district hasn't changed at all, but we've been able to, I think, based on the credibility of our work, do much better, and then be in a position to actually help candidates across the country.
Joe Donovan.
Congressman, you highlighted the value of the state's defense sector. You said on the
Yes.
Armed Services Committee
Massachusetts, as you know, is number 8 in total defense spend in the country. So in the rankings, we're number 8, so it's pretty important. But as you know, the defense dollars that are in Massachusetts primarily support innovation, education, and the things that you talk about and that you reference in your task force report. Small companies still have a challenge. They still have problems connecting in areas like artificial intelligence, autonomy, things that you and Congressman Banks highlighted in that report from 2020. So do you see any progress within the DoD, and even in the next budget, do you see a number of the priorities that you called out funded there to support, particularly small business?
Well, I think we're moving more in that direction, but I don't think we're innovating quickly enough. And here's the reality. With all great respect to Raytheon, which plays an incredibly important role in our defense, and is actually particularly well positioned for many of the challenges that we're facing right now with some of your technology, like your radar and missile technology, which is absolutely best in class, best in the world, and in super, super high demand. You know, that's what Ukraine really needs right now, is more Raytheon radar technology and missile technology to take out all these this terrible onslaught against the billionaires from Putin. That is what we need in the Western Pacific to stop this onslaught of Chinese missiles that will accompany any sort of invasion of Taiwan. But having said that, and at the risk of picking on you a little bit, you are a big defense contractor, and the reality is that a lot of innovation comes from smaller startup companies, especially not just smaller companies, but new companies that have new ideas, and they really have difficulty getting traction in this ecosystem. A lot of that has to do with the bureaucracy. You know, how many lawyers do you employ at Raytheon?
A lot.
A lot. And they know how to navigate this bureaucracy. You're starting a small company, you can't hire dozens and dozens of lawyers just to figure out how to navigate the defense bureaucracy, and that's a loss. That's a loss to us. It's ultimately a loss to companies like Raytheon, who in the short term don't have the competition, but in the long term don't benefit from perhaps acquiring those companies or just, you know, learning their technology. I mean, that's how the ecosystem should work, and it doesn't. So we continue to push on this, to push on acquisition reform, and to encourage the military to think differently about contracts. Here's an example. As you know, one of the weapon systems that we've supplied in great numbers to Ukraine and to great effect are Stinger missiles, right? Stinger missiles are an anti-aircraft missile that have been very effective at taking down Russian planes. And Russia does not control the skies over Ukraine. We haven't been able to close the skies, to use a Ukrainian term, to prevent all this onslaught. But there's not a whole bunch of sorties of Russian planes flying up there because we've been able to shoot them down with Stinger missiles. Now the DoD has gone to the maker of Stinger missiles, which happens to be Raytheon, and said, we need more Stinger missiles. Raytheon has come back and said, it's going to take 15 months to stay up the supply line. Again, with all due respect, that's just an unacceptable answer. And what I think DoD should do is say, all right, screw that, that's a 1980s technology. RFP, whoever can make a new anti-aircraft missile, go, be done in 6 months, and get it produced. And if you guys want to compete on that, great. If startups want to compete on that, great. But this is the United States of America. We shouldn't take 15 months to build a missile that we designed in the 1970s. Technology has progressed a lot since then, and we should have a much more advanced missile. But that's not the way our system thinks, and that's a problem. So, sorry to be a little bit punching back, but that's
exactly what you're saying.
You know,
we haven't built Stinger missiles in almost 18 years.
18 years since they built this technology. You don't think that we could come up with a better missile in the last 18 years? Come on.
Katie.
Hey, Katie.
Recovering health staffer, working with fighter now. I want to piggyback on the theme of innovation. Congress made a huge investment in science and technology with the CHIPS Plus Science Act, but beyond the CHIPS funding, it's primarily authorizations. I just wanted to get your sense on whether those aspirational goals in R&D and science and technology funding will be realized, or some move the needle on that in the appropriations process, or are we just is that process just so stuck? We see minimal increases each year. So
I mean, I'm not terribly optimistic. I mean, CHIPS was fundamentally bipartisan, but as soon as it started getting a little bigger, then there was this some shift in sentiment against it, which was just like a political, we don't want to, spend this much money. We don't mind spending money on tax cuts, especially if Trump authors them, but we can't spend money on innovation. Sorry to be glib, but that's kind of the philosophy. And so I'm not. I think that the fundamental answer to your question, like where is it going to go, it's a little hard to see. But let me also just step back and talk a little bit philosophically about this. I think that this is another place where the U.S. government, those of us here sitting in Congress, need to have a harder conversation with industry. Because, yes, China is subsidizing technology, and we want to compete with them. We've got to step up to the plate. I wish we could just convince China to stop subsidizing their companies, but we ain't going to do that. So we got to recognize that in order to be competitive, we're going to have to provide some subsidies as well. But we got to be very explicit about what we expect to get back. You know, what kinds of chip fabs you're going to build in America. What kinds of returns? You know, what sort of results are we expecting to see from this kind of investment? Because if it goes to stock buybacks and CEO salaries, that's not going to be satisfying to the American taxpayer, nor should it be. So I think we've got to get much more involved in exactly what we're going to get out of these investments in these new chip fabs, even though fundamentally I think it's what we need to do, and I was proud to support the legislation.
Maybe I'll just ask the last question. I know time is that you'll be going back right after the midterm election, probably for about 3 weeks. What do you think Congress can do in that period of time?
Jim, it's a great question, and honestly, not to avoid it, but I think so much depends on the result of the midterms. And there's a couple of different ways this could go. I mean, look, if Democrats hold on to the House, then obviously we're going to be in a position where we could actually pass a lot of stuff that we want to pass. Maybe get some jammed through appropriations bills or whatnot. But I think you could also see that scenario if it's close either way. So if Republicans take over, but it's not a huge landslide, then there may be some appetite in the lame duck to make some deals and to do things. And remember, if Kevin McCarthy only has a narrow majority, and there are still some moderate Republicans left, which I recognize are becoming few and far between, then there's going to be some room to work. On the other hand, if it's a landslide for the Republicans, I don't think much is going to get done at all, because I think the House and the Senate will be fundamentally opposed. The House will be interested in not just passing legislation or passing messaging bills, which is sort of like the best case scenario. I think they're going to immediately launch into Benghazi times 1,000, and it will just be investigation central. And we won't be talking about what to do about Taiwan. We won't be talking about how to invest in chip fabs. You know, we'll be talking about Hunter Biden, and that's it. So that's really what's at stake in these midterms, in my opinion.
Well, we want to thank the Congressman. If you'd like a photo with him, come on down and we thank you.
Thank you.